you do a little training evidence before us that you don't seem to have investigated, that it is possible that at Facebook, your employees do have the power to disadvantage conservative viewpoints, and that they in fact have used that power in ways that we need to root out.
Congressman, my testimony in the past and today is about what our principles are as a company and what we try to do. Of course, when you have tens of thousands of employees, people make mistakes, people have some of their own goals some of the time, and it's our job in running the company to make sure that we minimize errors and that we make sure that the company's operations reflect the principles that we intend to run it on.
And when you fire people as a consequence of their politics, do you think that that impacts the culture and perhaps empowers some of the content moderators to also treat people worse as a consequence of their politics?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'm not aware of any case where we have fired someone on behalf of their politics, and I would say that that would be an inappropriate thing for us to do.
Why did you fire Palmer Luckey?
Congressman, I'm not sure it's appropriate to get into a specific personnel issue publicly.
I mean, I could just tell you that Palmer Luckey's NDA with you, I only have 10 seconds, but Palmer Luckey's NDA with you doesn't allow him to talk to anyone except government officials. I'm a government official. I've seen the messages where you have specifically directed Mr. Luckey to make statements regarding his politics for the benefit of your company. So I think both in the case of these content moderators and in the case of the testimony you just gave regarding Mr. Luckey and firing people over their politics, there is serious question as to whether or not you're giving truthful testimony here or whether it's lying before Congress. I see my time's expired, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pache, I wanted to focus a little bit on Google's acquisition of YouTube and some of the consequences of that move for consumer privacy and competition. Now, Google purchased YouTube in 2006 after identifying it as a potential rival that could eventually draw business away from Google. And it's my understanding Google paid $1.65 billion for that acquisition, nearly 30 times its original bid of $50 million. So could you tell us why Google was willing to pay so much more beyond the initial proposed bid? And was this as a result of any analysis on the harm Google would suffer if a competitor had purchased YouTube?
Congresswoman, we acquired YouTube in 2006, and this was well before my time there as CEO, and I wasn't directly involved. But what I do recall at the time is that we saw it as a new emerging area, and our mission is to help users with information. We saw an opportunity, and it wasn't clear. YouTube only had 67 people.
Okay, was Mr. Page in charge of that decision?
Congresswoman, I wasn't directly involved, but I'm pretty sure our senior leadership team at that time definitely looked into it.
Okay, I would encourage the subcommittee to take the steps necessary to have us hear from whoever was in charge of that. Moving on, Google is now by far the top online site where Americans watch videos, including children's videos. And as I'm sure you're aware, federal law prevents companies from collecting data on children under 13. However, just last year, the Federal Trade Commission found that Google had spent years knowingly collecting data on children under 13 on YouTube and offering advertisers the ability to target those children directly. Mr. Pache, did YouTube use the data it illegally acquired to improve its ability to target ads to children?
We are, this is an area, I take it very seriously. I'm a parent too. We are committed. We have invested tremendously. We have a dedicated product for kids in YouTube Kids. On the main YouTube platform, we make sure we have clear policies. We enforce them rigorously. Just in Q4 of 2019, we flagged and removed almost close to 1 million videos, potentially for concerns around child safety. So it's an area we are investing rigorously and will continue to do so.
Well, I'm more concerned about the fact that you're investing rigorously in luring in advertisers like toy makers, Mattel, and Hasbro by telling them that YouTube is the #1 website regularly visited by kids. So That sounds like you're targeting the kids and then targeting advertisers to bring them on board. Is that correct?
Today, in the main site of YouTube, we don't allow anyone under 13 to create accounts. There are scenarios in which there could be family viewing, and today there are creators who create content oriented towards families, and as part of that, there are advertisers which are interested in connecting with those users. But everything we do here, we obviously comply with all the applicable regulations. And
Okay, well, let's look at some of the content that is specifically for children. COPPA makes it illegal to target those kids, but we've got an issue where content creators are in a very difficult position now. So if a show like Sesame Street doesn't want to show ads for junk food on YouTube, does YouTube allow it to make that choice?
Today, we do, we have choices both for creators in terms of, tools and preferences, and we have extensive tools for advertisers, and above all for users, we give a choice. They can either use YouTube as a subscription service without seeing those types of ads, or they can use it for free with ads. So we give choice, and for us, it is of utmost importance that YouTube is a place where people come to learn, and we find increasingly small and medium businesses use YouTube to thrive, especially even during COVID. Particularly
Let's go back to content that's designed for children. So, if there's an organization like Sesame Street that wants to provide child-centered content, but they don't want that content to be sullied, shall we say, with junk food ads or something, my understanding is that you say that the content creators can do that, but we've got a recent report from the Wall Street Journal that says YouTube hasn't been honoring those requests. And it's been making it difficult for independent auditing companies like OpenSlate to independently audit that and then report back to those content creators about whether or not YouTube is honoring those. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the particular report, but I'm happy to understand it better and have my office follow up with your staff, Congressman.
I would appreciate that. My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair would I recognize himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bezos, thank you for being here today. In your opening statement, I reviewed your written testimony. You indicated, and I'll just quote, that Amazon accounts for less than 1% of the $25 trillion global retail market and less than 4% of retail in the U.S. End quote. When you refer to retail, I take it based on the empirical studies I've reviewed, you're referring to a broad definition of retail that includes restaurants, bars, gas stations. So it's a fairly all-encompassing view of retail. I wonder if you know what percentage of Amazon's sales are represented in the terms of online retail sales, the e-commerce market stream.
The figures I've seen for, I don't, with all respect, I don't accept that e-commerce is a different market, but as a different channel, what I've seen is sort of 30 to 40% is the outside studies that I've seen where Amazon's share of that e-commerce channel.
And that's consistent with the data that I have seen. The latest figure I saw was 40%. And so in terms of how we define it, whether it's a stream or a channel, nonetheless, I do think that just factually, it's important. It's an important distinction that I want to make sure we clear here. Obviously, I suspect you understand more than most that the early stages of a startup where entrepreneurs are undertaking risks to bring their products and services to market. Over the course of our investigation, we've heard directly from startups who rely on Amazon services, and that includes obviously Representative Jayapal's questions, Representative Buck, my colleague from Colorado, with respect to concerns about the way in which Amazon uses confidential information. But we've also heard that not just with respect to the marketplace, but Amazon's cloud computing arm, AWS, the notion that that computing arm essentially identifies startups' best technologies and rolls out replica products and services. So, Mr. Bezos, does Amazon use confidential information that companies share via AWS to build competing services?
No, sir, not that I'm aware of. AWS does often, they do keep expanding their services. AWS started, 15 years ago. We invented this entire category.
Let me just clarify that, Mr. Bezos. I appreciate that. Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. But last week, one of Amazon's former engineers posted online that he and his team, quote, proactively identified growing businesses on AWS, that they built competing products, and that they targeted those products to the business's customers. And there's been public reporting on that strategy. So I guess I wonder if you can comment on that and how you would account for those statements.
Well, I think there may be categories, some databases of different kinds and so on, where we see that it's an important product for customers, and we make our own product offering in that arena. But it doesn't mean we stop servicing the other companies that are also making those products. We have competitors using AWS, and we work very hard to make them successful. Netflix is one example, Hulu is another, and so on.
I think the concern, Mr. Bezos, with respect is that the pattern emerges across the different components in Amazon, whether it's the marketplace or whether it's the cloud service, as I mentioned. In addition, there was an article, I'm sure you're aware, in the Wall Street Journal regarding the Alexa Fund, that according to news reports, Amazon's venture capital fund, the Alexa Fund, had invested in a number of different companies. I believe you're familiar with the Alexa Fund investing, for example, in Defined Crowd Corp. Does that ring a bell?
No, sir, I'm afraid it doesn't.
Okay, well, I'll represent to you, according to the Wall Street Journal, and I'll just quote from them, when Amazon Incorporated's venture capital fund invested in Defined Crowd Corp, it gained access to the technology startup's finances and other confidential information. Nearly 4 years later, in April, Amazon's cloud computing unit launched an artificial intelligence product that does almost exactly what Defined Crowd does, said Defined Crowd founder and chief executive Daniel Braja. Does that refresh your recollection? Are you aware of those allegations?
I read that article, but I didn't remember that piece of it. I apologize for that. I don't know the specifics of that situation, and I would be happy to get back to your office with more information about that.
Well, I would appreciate, I certainly would welcome that, and to the extent that you all can follow up with the subcommittee with respect to this particular article and the different episodes that are referenced, both in terms of Defined Crowd Corp. There's also another company called Nucleus that you may be familiar with. The reason why I ask these questions, the reason why it matters, Mr. Bezos, to me, is that we are very concerned about this innovation kill zone that seems to be emerging. I represent Boulder and Fort Collins, two of the fastest growing and most innovative tech hubs in the country, and entrepreneurs and founders shared their stories with this committee during one of our field hearings, actually a field hearing that we held at the University of Colorado Law School just earlier this year. And they are extremely dependent on big technology firms, including in terms of investment and capital, yet they live in constant fear that the platforms could steal their core technologies or ideas, making it impossible to compete because of those existing advantages. So I see my time has expired, but we will certainly be following up with respect to the episodes that I referenced. With that, I would yield back. Gentleman's time has expired. And the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Macbeth, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cook, Facebook acquired WhatsApp in 2014, and at that time, Sheryl Sandberg told the board that the deal was critical for countering the App Store power of Apple and Google, who choke off Facebook's access to mobile devices. Was Sheryl Sandberg correct? Does Apple have the power to exclude apps from the App Store?
If you look at the history of this Congresswoman, we've increased the number of apps from 500 to 1.7 million. So there's a very wide gate for the App Store. And there's fierce competition for developers, and we want every app we can on the platform.
Okay, so but Mr. Cook, then what you're saying is that Apple can exclude apps from the App Store. In fact, it has. In 2018, Apple introduced an app called Screen Time, which helps people limit the amount of time they or their kids spend on their iPhones. Is that correct?
It sounds right.
Okay, but before Screen Time existed, there were other apps in the App Store that gave parents control over their kids' phone usage, apps like Our Pact and Kids Locks, and parents depended on them. Soon after you introduced Screen Time, however, you removed these competing apps from the App Store. One mother wrote to Apple saying, and I quote her, "I am deeply disappointed that you have decided to remove this app and others like it, thereby reducing consumer access to much-needed services to keep children safe and protect their mental health and well-being. Mr. Cook, why did Apple remove competing apps right after you released Screen Time?
We were concerned, Congresswoman, about the privacy and security of kids. The technology that was being used at that time was called MDM, and it had the ability to sort of take over the kid's screen, and a third party could see it. And so we were worried about their safety.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Today
that.
we have...
I appreciate that, but the timing of the removal seems very coincidental. If Apple wasn't attempting to harm competitors in order to help its own app, why did Phil Schiller, who runs the App Store, promote the Screen Time app to customers who complained about the removal of rival parental control apps?
Congresswoman, I can't see this email. I'm sorry, my eyes are not good enough to read it. But I see Screen Time as just an alternative, that there are over 30 parental control apps that are in the App Store today. And so there's vibrant competition for parental controls out there.
Okay. Well, Mr. Cook, the fact is that Apple sidelined Screen Time's competition by keeping them out of the App Store. And while Apple claims these competitors weren't meeting Apple's privacy standards, these apps creators say that you admitted them back in 6 months later without requiring significant privacy changes. And, of course, 6 months is truly an eternity for small businesses to be shut down. Even worse, if all the while a larger competitor is actually taking away customers. And, you know, this is not the first time something like this seems to have happened, Mr. Cook. Let me give you another example, of the harm that's been caused to your competitors. In 2010, Apple introduced an online bookstore called the iBookstore, where it offered ebooks. And the only major publisher that didn't agree to join iBookstore was Random House. Random House wanted to offer its own ebooks through its own apps and submitted their apps to be added to the App Store. Amidst continued negotiations between Apple and Random House, Senior VP Eddie Q said, and I'm quoting him, I'm quoting him when he said, it prevented an app from Random House from going live in the App Store. Q himself cited this app rejection as a factor in finally getting Random House to give in and join iBookstore. Mr. Cook, is it fair for Apple to use its power over the App Store to pressure a business to join Apple's own app?
I can't see the email, and so I don't know the context of it, but there are many reasons why an app might not initially go through the App Store gate, because it may not work properly. There may be other issues with it, so it's very difficult to see. What I would say, though, on a macro basis, the gate to the App Store is very wide. We have 1.7 million apps in it. It's become an economic miracle.
Okay.
With over $138 billion of commerce just in the United States.
Mr. Cook, I really, really appreciate that sentiment. But, I want to say to you that Apple enjoys enormous power to control which apps can reach consumers. Even some of the largest companies in the country fear your power. Our evidence suggests that your company has used its power to harm your rivals and boost your own business. This is fundamentally unfair. It harms small businesses that rely on you to reach customers. It stifles the innovation that is the lifeblood of our economy. Ultimately, it reduces the competition and choices that are made available to consumers, and that is a great concern to all of us. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. That concludes that round. In light of the request of Mr. Gates for a third round, and because many of my colleagues would like to get more fulsome answers on a number of issues, we'll proceed to a final round, and my expectation is we will conclude within the hour. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Zuckerberg, we've seen the dominance of several of the companies appearing before us today, that it's not just harmful to our economy and competition, but it's harmful to the founding principles of our democracy. Facebook and Google are designed to keep users on their platforms, whatever the cost. Because disinformation, propaganda, and hateful speech are good for engagement, they're good for business. But over 100 years ago, the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic." My first question is, Mr. Zuckerberg, do you agree with that principle, that there are limits to harmful and false speech, and that are particularly important when it comes to the health and safety of the public?
Congressman, I certainly do, and I actually think that our policies go further than just limiting those types of things.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, you have 1 billion users and almost 50,000 employees, and so you agree you have a responsibility to remove harmful lies from your platform, correct?
Congressman, I think we have a responsibility to limit the spread of content that's going to be harmful for people. And also, if you, I'd like to add that I do not believe that we have any incentive to have this content on our service. People don't like it.
Except that, Mr. Zuckerberg, with all due respect, except that it is often the most engaging. It's the most, it brings the most likes, or it brings the most activity, which of course produces great profit. So you do have an incentive. The more engagement there is, the more money you make on advertising. So let me ask you a question. Let me give you some specific examples that will illustrate my concerns. These are some of the top 10 most shared articles on Facebook in 2020. Trump suggests injection of disinfectant to beat coronavirus and clean the lungs. Coronavirus hype, biggest political hoax in history. U.S. hospitals getting paid more to label cause of death as coronavirus. During the greatest public health crisis of our lifetime, don't you agree that these articles viewed by millions on your platform will cost lives?
Congressman, with respect, we certainly have policies that prohibit false information about COVID that would lead to imminent harm. And we've been quite aggressive about taking that down, as some of the questioning from the other side of the aisle has shown so far.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg,
I'm quite proud of our efforts here.
Well,
we
with all due respect, the problem is Facebook is profiting off and amplifying disinformation that harms others because it's profitable. This isn't a speech issue. It's about Facebook's business model that prioritizes engagement in order to keep people on Facebook's platform to serve up more advertisements. So I'll ask you very specifically, what are you doing right now to protect people from demonstrably false claims related to this deadly pandemic?
Congressman, I'll certainly answer that, but I have to disagree with the assertion that you're making that this content is somehow helpful for our business. It is not what people want to see, and we rank our what we show in feed based on what is going to be the most meaningful to people and is going to create long-term satisfaction, not what's just going to get engagement or clicks today. That's a common misperception about the company.
If that's true, Mr. Zuckerberg, how do you explain that on Monday, the second most popular post on Facebook was a Breitbart video claiming that you don't need a mask and hydroxychloroquine is a cure for COVID. And in the first 5 hours after being posted on Facebook, it racked up 20 million views and over 100,000 comments before Facebook acted to remove it.
Well, Congressman, a lot of people shared that, and we did take it down because it violates our policies. We work with the CDC.
After 20 million people saw it over the period of 5 hours. I mean, doesn't that suggest, Mr. Zuckerberg, that your platform is so big that even with the right policies in place, you can't contain deadly content?
Congressman, I don't think so. I think we have, on COVID misinformation in particular, a relatively good track record of fighting and taking down lots of false content, as well as putting up authoritative information. We have built a COVID information center.
I understand
with authoritative information from health officials.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. I just have one more question for you.
2 billion people.
I appreciate that. Mr. Zuckerberg, if a television station runs a false political advertisement, they're held liable for that. Why should Facebook or any other platform be different? While you may not be a publisher, you're responsible maybe not for the first posting, but you then take that posting and you apply a set of algorithms that decide how you will disseminate that, which is a business decision, not a First Amendment decision. And it's hard to understand why Facebook shouldn't be responsible for those business decisions.
Congressman, in terms of political ads, we've modeled a lot of our policies off of the FCC guidelines on broadcasters and their requirements to run political ads equally from all different sides.
Well,
Cable
I
networks,
think this,
of course, have more.
yeah, I think these examples, unfortunately, Mr. Zuckerberg, are just the tip of the iceberg. It's not just about COVID. Facebook hosts or enables countless pages and ads that are dedicated to conspiracy theories and calls to violence, including content that led to the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And Facebook gets away with it because you're the only game in town. There's no competition forcing you to police your own platform. Allowing this misinformation to spread can lead to violence. And frankly, I believe it strikes at the very heart of American democracy. And with that, I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, in 2016, there was an internal Google meeting. You attended that meeting along with Sergey Brin. A video of that meeting was leaked to Breitbart. And at the meeting, top Google executives, including Kent Walker, lamented Trump's victory. They compared Trump voters to extremists, and it was discussed that there was an intent to make the Trump win a blip in the populist movement in American history. Now, I know you've testified today in response to my questions and Mr. Jordan's questions that you don't intend this time to engage in electioneering on behalf of the former vice president. But given the video evidence of senior members of your team in your presence saying that they had the intent to make the Trump victory a blip, why should we believe that testimony today?
Congressman, we do not have a view on, we respect the democratic process. We are deeply committed to it. As a company, we take pride in the information we provide to help people participate in free elections. And we are deeply committed to it, as I said to Congressman Jordan as well.
Do you remember that meeting? 2016 that you attended?
Yes, I do. It was in the context of, through the election across both sides, there was a lot of opinions. And as you know, elections are kind of a polarizing moment generally in the country. And there was a lot of rhetoric about certain issues which were
I understand rhetoric. I guess the question is, when the senior members of your team in your presence said that they did have the intent to change the outcome in a subsequent election, and then since that moment in time where we've seen all of these conservative websites and conservative viewpoints censored, you can understand why people would be concerned. So after your employees and top executives said in your presence that they intended to make the Trump victory a blip, what action did you take as the CEO to protect and preserve the neutrality of your platform?
Congressman, no one had a view on, ever interfering with elections or so on. But what I can tell you is we've made it very clear about 2 years ago, we announced new community guidelines for within Google, clearly making it clear that, employees obviously are free to have their political views, but none of that they shouldn't bring that as they work on any of our products. And if we found any evidence that people are using a political agenda to manipulate any of our content platforms, we would take strong enforcement action.
We have sort of a string of events here. We have the 2016 meeting where people demonstrated their intent to make changes to hurt the president. It's like Breitbart and Gateway Pundit and others. I'm going to move on. Hate, but it seems you have empowered donations on your Amazon Smile platform have said the Catholic Family News, Catholic Family Ministries, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, and should be treated differently. Dr. Carson is on the cabinet. Confidence in a group that seems to be so out of step and seems to take mainstream Christian doctrine and label it as hate.
Sir, it's a good question. We have, for those of you who don't know what Amazon Smile is, it's a program that allows customers to designate a certain fraction of their purchases to go to charity that we then pay for. And they can select from any one of millions of charities. And we use the Southern Poverty Law Center data to say which charities are extremist organizations. We also use the U.S. Foreign Asset Office to do the same thing.
But
Those
why?
two together.
Since they're calling
This is-
Catholics and these Jewish groups hateful groups, why would you trust them?
Sir, I'm going to acknowledge this is an imperfect system, and
No doubt.
I would love suggestions on better or additional sources.
My suggestion
for how
would be a
to-
divorce from the SPLC, and I see that I'm out of time, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair. I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Facebook is dominant not just in the social media market, but also in its digital surveillance capabilities. In 2012, Facebook had several tools that allowed it to conduct digital surveillance, including trackers, Facebook's like button.
Is yes.
Right.
We, every other company here, do market research to understand what people are finding valuable. And
All right, okay,
across
so
the
you're
internet.
going beyond the scope of my question. I appreciate that answer, though. Mr. Zuckerberg, a few days before Facebook acquired Instagram, a Facebook vice president emailed you suggesting ways to improve Facebook's, quote, competitive research, end quote. By building a custom model, Facebook could improve its understanding of its competitors and, quote, make more bold decisions on whether they are friends or foes, end quote. Mr. Zuckerberg, how does Facebook improve its competitive research to distinguish friends from foe?
Congressman, I'm not sure exactly what he was referring to in that email there, but he is one of the people involved in running our analytics organization, and I think it's natural that he would, as part of his responsibility, be focused on market research and understanding more there.
And certainly, isn't it true that Facebook, after that conversation, purchased the web analytics company Onevo in 2013 to give Facebook more capability to monitor its competitors?
Congressman, I think you have the timing correct. After we purchased Onevo as part of our broader market research capacity.
And that would give you the capability to monitor your competitors, correct?
Congressman, it gave aggregate analytics as to what people were using and what people were finding valuable. Sort of like the type of product you would get from Nielsen or ComScore, some of these other third-party companies that provide similar data.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, that acquisition gave you non-public real-time data about engagement, usage, and how much time people spend on apps. And when it became public that Facebook was using Onevo to conduct digital surveillance, your company got kicked out of Apple's App Store. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I'm not sure I'd characterize it in that way. I think this was
Yeah, I
part
mean,
of a broader
Onevo
policy
did
around-
get kicked out of the App Store. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I believe we took the app out after Apple changed their policies.
And it was
about what
because
type
of
VPN apps.
it was because of the use of the surveillance tools.
Congressman, I'm not sure that the policy was worded that way, or that that's exactly the right characterization of it. But
Okay, well, let me ask you
but
this
Apple changed their
question.
policy.
Let me ask you this question. After Onevo was booted out of the App Store, you turned to other surveillance tools such as Facebook Research app, correct?
Congressman, in general, yes, we do a broad variety of market research, as do other
And
companies.
also, isn't it true, Mr. Zuckerberg, that Facebook paid teenagers to sell their privacy by installing Facebook Research app?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that, but I think it's a general practice to be able to that companies use to have different surveys and understand data from how people are using different products and what their preferences are.
Facebook Research app got thrown out of the App Store too. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, well, over nearly a decade, Mr. Zuckerberg, you led a sustained effort to surveil smaller competitors to benefit Facebook. These were steps taken to abuse data, to harm competitors, and to shield Facebook from competition. You tried one thing and then you got caught. made some apologies, then you did it all over again. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I respectfully disagree with that characterization. I think every company engages in research to understand what their customers are enjoying so that they can learn and make their products better. And that's what we were trying to do. That's what our analytics team was doing. And I think in general, that allowed us to make our services better. It was one of the signals that we had about WhatsApp's trajectory, but we didn't need it. Without that, it was pretty clear that WhatsApp was a great product. I already had a relationship with Jan Koum, the founder.
And it was a competitor.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for all four, yes or no answer. Do you believe that the Chinese government steals technology from U.S. companies? Start with Mr. Cook.
I don't know of specific cases where we have been stolen from by the government.
So you don't believe that the Chinese government's stealing technology from U.S. companies, or you're just saying that not from yours?
I'm saying I know of no case on ours where it occurred, which is I can only speak to firsthand knowledge.
Mr. Pichai, do you believe that the Chinese government steals technology from United States companies?
Congressman, I have no firsthand knowledge of any information stolen from Google in this regard.
Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, I think it's well documented that the Chinese government steals technology from American companies.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Bezos? You're on mute.
Mr. Bezos, I believe you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I have heard many reports of that, and I haven't seen it personally, but I've heard many reports of it.
So of all the different products that Amazon carries, you haven't seen that in any of the companies that sell products on Amazon or your company yourself?
Oh, well, certainly there are knockoff products, if that's what you mean, and there are counterfeit products and all of that. But the Chinese, if the answer is the Chinese government stealing technology, that's the thing I've read reports of, but don't have personal experience with.
It's no secret that Europe increasingly seems to have an agenda of attacking large, successful U.S. tech companies. Yet Europe's approach to regulation in general, and antitrust in particular, seems to have been much less successful than America's approach. America is a remarkable nursery for innovation and entrepreneurship in pursuit of the American dream. As you all know from direct experience, this is a country where it's possible to start a company from a garage or a dorm room and experience tremendous success. Do you have any recommendations on how Congress can better protect U.S. firms and U.S. companies from aggression and government intervention abroad, not just in Europe, but in China as well? Anybody that would like to chime in, I'll open it up to any of you. None of you have any recommendations on how Congress can better protect U.S. companies like yourself? All right, well, now I'll yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gates.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Zuckerberg, what is a digital land grab?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, in the emails that your company produced to the committee, there's one from David Wehner in 2014 where he's describing under the mergers and acquisitions argument, and we should own that. And it goes on to describe a strategy wherein Facebook would spend 5 to 10% of its market cap each year to shore up its market position. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes, Congressman. Thanks for the opportunity to address this and frankly, to correct the record, because I believe that what he was referring to was a question that was incoming from investors about whether we would continue to acquire different companies. I don't think that wasn't referring to an internal strategy. It was referring to an external question that we were facing about how investors should expect us to act going forward. And I think he was discussing the fact that as mobile phones were growing in popularity, there were a lot of new ways that people could connect and communicate that were part of this overall broader space and market around human connection and helping people stay connected and share their experiences.
Okay, well, Mr. Zuckerberg, it seems to be both internal and external, because then in an email from you in 2012, we see a similar sentiment expressed. You write, "We can likely always just buy any competitive startups." So is your desire to limit competition by purchasing your competitors consistent with the message to your investors that the way you'll run your company is through digital land grabs?
Congressman, I'm not sure I agree with the characterization of how we communicated with investors. But
it's your words, Mr. Zuckerberg.
But I think the broader point is that there were a lot of new ways that people can connect that were created by smartphones.
But this is about your merger and acquisition strategy. You went on to say one thing about startups is you can often acquire them. So, I mean, I'm not interested in how people connect. I'm interested in how you acquire businesses to limit competition.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Congressman, in order to serve people better and help people connect in all the ways they want, we innovated and built a lot of new use cases internally, and we acquired others. And that, I think, has been a very successful strategy at serving people well. And a lot of the companies that we've been able to acquire have gone on to reach and help connect many more people than they would have been able to on their own.
You've grabbed a lot of land. I would say I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cook, we've heard from businesses that Apple is canvassing the App Store to determine whether it can extract commissions from apps that have changed their business models in response to the pandemic. Businesses that relied on in-person interactions have moved online, and Apple is looking for its cut. Our staff has heard from some of the affected businesses. They say you're calling them up, demanding your 30%. Isn't this pandemic profiteering?
We would never do that, Mr. Chairman. The pandemic is a tragedy, and it's hurting Americans and many people from all around the world, and we would never take advantage of that. I believe the cases that you're talking about are cases where something has moved to a digital service, which technically does need to go through our commission model. But in both of the cases that I'm aware of, we are working with the developers. To sort of zoom out and to give you some historical context on this, when we entered the App Store market, the cost of distributing software was 50 to 70%. And so we took the rate in half and to 30%, and we've held it in that same level over time or lowered it. It's now responsible for 2 million jobs across America, and 84% of the apps on the store are distributed for free, where 100% of the proceeds go to the developer. Only that 16% is subject to a commission of either 15 or 30%.
And school is about to start around the country, and millions of parents and students will attend school online. They will rely on apps to talk to teachers, tutors, and virtual learning tools. Are these online learning tools next on Apple's, are they on Apple's list to monetize?
They're not, Mr. Chairman. We're very proud of what we've done in education.